I'm Tori, and today I'm going to be reviewing Coyote America by Dan Flores. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Elijah Alexander. So this was a really interesting book. It basically discussed everything about the history of coyotes, the history of their evolution, of all the mythology around them in Native American culture, of European settlers studying coyotes and interacting with them, and the way the American government has interacted with them over the years. And it was just a really fascinating, in-depth look at everything related to coyotes. The author talked about his experiences getting to know the coyote and why it became the species he wanted to study, and it just had a lot of really useful information. There were some parts that seemed a little bit extreme and that I thought could have been handled better, but overall I really enjoyed the book. I loved hearing about the history of the way Europeans studied the coyote, and that they weren't sure if it was a wolf or a fox. Eventually they decided it was its own species, and debating who actually discovered that the coyote was its own species, and the different ways it had been written about in literature. I loved the different little myths sprinkled in. The book would be going along and you'd be talking about evolution and ecology and all that, and then there'd be like a little myth, and these myths focused on the Native American god Coyote. And it was really interesting to see all of his mischievous behavior, and that seemed so in keeping with coyotes. And it was also interesting, the author drew a lot of parallels between coyotes and humans, and he would talk about how we had kind of similar evolution, and we were a very similar sort of species. We're both very adaptive and very cunning, and that coyotes and humans have a fairly rare trait that they are okay living either in groups or individually, and that gives them a big advantage and makes them a lot more likely to survive because they are so adaptive. It was also fascinating and horrifying to hear about the ways that we have fought the coyote. For a long time the government was trying to completely eradicate the species because they are a pest to farmers. And this book focused solely on the environmental perspective. They didn't talk at all about, well, we do like to eat, we do need to keep the coyotes from killing all of our domestic animals. And so it talked about all the different ways that farmers and the government as a whole have tried to eradicate the species over the years, and the poison bait stations they would leave. That was the hardest part for me, because apparently what they would do is they would lead horses out into the desert areas where coyotes live, and they would shoot the horse and then poison the body, and then that would kill the coyotes and any other scavengers that came to feed on it. And that was very horrifying and very unsettling. And even people who are trying to be good environmentalists and protect nature don't always go about it in the best way. There was this whole section about how there was this one species of wolf that they were trying to preserve, and they kept interbreeding with the coyotes. And so their answer to try to preserve this species of wolf was to track down every single animal that was the offspring of a coyote and this wolf and kill them so it wouldn't dilute the wolf gene pool. And it made you realize that people do pretty horrific things to animals sometimes. Even when they are trying to advocate for them, they don't always do a very good job with it. And the author was making a really good case for protecting the coyotes more and trying to be more just to them. But then he kind of went a little bit off the rails, because he'd been building up talking about the history of all the things that we had done to coyotes, and, we're trying to change our ways, and, he was advocating for more change. But then there was this whole chapter where he arranged an interview with government workers in charge of managing the coyotes, and they're basically trying to balance environmental needs with agricultural needs. And the author in this interview made it seem like this horrible, sneak attack thing, and he scheduled an interview with these people, and they're just there trying to do their jobs, and they're only allowed to do what they're authorized to do by this big bureaucratic agency that they work for. And the author was really attacking them personally and trying to back them into a corner and make them admit things that they were happy to admit, and it seemed pretty extreme and not very rational and well thought out. The rest of the book was pretty well thought out and made some really good arguments, but this was a much less sound chapter to me. I did also think it was interesting. At the very end of the book, the author shared the story of the most horrific coyote attack that has been recorded, of a coyote attacking a human. And it was this big graphic story, and then in that chapter, the author explained why it was an anomaly and why people didn't really need to be worried about coyotes. But it was the last thing you heard from this book, and I felt like that would have been more effective to make the author's point at the beginning, where he explained, oh, people are scared of coyotes, and this is why. And then he spent the rest of the book explaining why that was an anomaly, and why coyotes usually wouldn't do that, and why it's important to defend them. But he only left himself a tiny little bit at the end of the book to do that, and I felt like there wasn't really enough time for that to digest properly. So this was a really fascinating book. I feel like I learned a lot about coyotes. The author really wanted me to become emotionally invested in the coyote struggle and work to defend them, and I did, but I'm also taking what he said with a grain of salt, because some of his views were a little bit extreme. But that did give me a lot to think about, and I am very glad that I read this book.